Hello, and welcome to a special Ask Me Anything episode of Think Twice. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, you still don't have to wait a full week for more of our content. There is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find The Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. First, I want to thank everyone who sent in questions. We can't answer all of them, but I selected and edited the best ones, which I think are fairly representative. Let's start with this one from Bruce Bernberg of New Jersey. He has two questions. First, are you related to Mike Tobin of Fox News? And second, can you give an overview of your political journey over time? Well, first, Bruce, thank you for writing. No, I'm not related to Mike Tobin of Fox News. I'm not really related to any famous or wealthy Tobin that I know of, but thank you about that. As for my political journey, let's start at home. I grew up in a working-class Jewish home, but one where books were valued. We made weekly trips to the public library. So credit to my mother especially, Frieda Drach Tobin, for that. As a primary first political influence, I would look to William F. Buckley. And I was introduced really to the world of ideas by his great show, Firing Line, which, as I said, would introduce me to the great debates about ideas as a kid watching on TV, and as well as music and many other things that the great William Buckley was interested in, and that influenced me greatly. A second influence, I didn't really know about Commentary Magazine until I got to college. I used to read National Review and New Republic in my public high school library. But once I got to college at Columbia, I did learn about commentary and the great Norman Podhoretz. And that helped shape a lot of my views about Israel and the world. And thanks to him, thanks to the late Bill Buckley, and of course to my mother. Next, Ed Ostrovitz writes, I'm an avid follower of JNS and supporter from Plano, Texas. My question is, why is there so little reporting and discussion about the fact that American Airlines and United Airlines are refusing to fly to Israel? Well, Ed, that is a good question. I think the decision of major airlines, not El Al, not to fly to Israel is really a disgrace. There's no reason for them to do so. There is a market for it, but I think they have been scared, in part by the Biden administration, which did the same thing in 2021, into pressuring, or if not pressuring, but setting an atmosphere in which Israel is sort of set aside, treated as an active war zone. Now, of course, there is a danger. Israel is under attack at times, but there's never been any real safety issues about Ben Gurion Airport. There's no reason for them to be leaving the Israeli market. And frankly, there's an opportunity for some other airlines, other than El Al, which has certainly benefited from it, to take up the slack. There is still, a lot of desire for people to go to Israel, and they should be encouraged to do so. And I would also add, airlines should not be scared by the woke mob, which is attacking Israel nonstop, and from its supporters within the U.S. government, which is about to change. So as to why this isn't reported, well, this is just another part of mainstream media bias, the corporate liberal media, and their bias against Israel, in which the story of how Israel is discriminated against is sort of swept under the rug. And instead, they just focus on repeating the lies about Israel told by Hamas, in some ways acting, as we've said, over the course of the last year and 3 months as Hamas's stenographers, and the woke leftist enemies of Israel and the right of the Jewish people to one Jewish state on this planet. And I think it's all a part. It's not the biggest story about Israel, but you're right. The way the business community has, at least some of these airlines have been scared out of flying to Israel is part of the overall information war against Israel. Next, Jonathan Firearm writes, I really enjoy the JNS podcast. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you to the others who wrote into the praise. And Jonathan Firearm asks, do you think that Turkey's President Recep Erdogan will use the new leaders of Syria to try and invade Israel as he said he wanted to do before? Well, interesting question. Turkey is certainly a player in Syria. They have taken advantage of the void that was created in part because of Israel's defeat of Hezbollah in Lebanon. That removed Hezbollah from being a factor in keeping Assad in power. The Russians are too preoccupied with their war on Ukraine to exert their influence. Iran has left Syria. And Turkey, which has certainly supported some of the rebels who now are sitting in Damascus, probably feels that it has an ally and, can influence them in some ways. I doubt they will try to invade Israel because, number one, Turkey has no ability to invade Israel. And the Syrian rebels have their own problems. They are obviously trying to consolidate their control over all of Syria, which certainly creates peril for Christians and for the Kurds in the northeastern part of Syria. But they're in no position to challenge the IDF. But your question does bring up the question of what to do about Syria. As I've written, as soon as the barbarous Assad regime fell, some of the same people in the foreign policy establishment who are always ready to say the United States must jump in with aid and get behind the new people because they must somehow be better. Well, we hope they're better, but I'm not sure that there's any rational reason to believe these people. Some of their leader, Jolani, used to be part of al-Qaeda and ISIS. I don't know why we think he's some Jeffersonian liberal or even anything that the United States really can do business with. I think we have to take a wait-and-see attitude towards Syria. I think Israel was right to control the border area, making sure that there is no danger to the Jewish state from this development, and to put the new government in Damascus on notice that it will put up with no nonsense from them, whether it's inspired by Turkey or anyone else. The notion of the United States massively investing in Syria is, it sort of makes sense to the Dom Friedmans of the New York Times of the world and to all of the other foreign policy establishment mandarins, but it doesn't really make sense to ordinary Americans, and it certainly shouldn't make sense to any really informed observer. This is not a country that can be fixed, and it remains to be seen whether they can fix themselves, but it certainly can't be fixed by the United States and Western aid. If there's some humanitarian issues, humanitarian aid no doubt will be forthcoming. But I'm afraid that the aftermath of Assad's ouster will lead to more fighting, and certainly the Kurds may be involved. And I think both Israel and the United States are deeply sympathetic to the Kurds. But the idea that the United States will sooner or later have to mount some sort of rescue mission for them, which I don't doubt is in the back of some people's minds, that's kind of nuts. I don't think and it's something that the Trump administration probably will have no interest in, and certainly they were not elected to do anything like that. Syria will have to take care of itself. And hopefully they'll straighten out. They won't be as barbarous as Assad, and will not be in the pocket of Erdogan the way Assad was in the pocket of Iran and to a certain extent Russia. But whatever they do, the West should not invest in what is, I think, a very poor investment in terms of putting aid. I think even if we were to land a huge army of social workers and teachers and soldiers to protect them, I don't think that would fix Syria, just as it didn't fix Iraq, it didn't fix Afghanistan. We can't impose a democracy on people who don't want it or are not ready for it. And we'll just have to hope for the best with the Syrians. Hope, the Syrian civil war did its worst. There were millions of casualties, hundreds of thousands of casualties, millions of refugees, which caused havoc in Europe, which we're still feeling the effects of, especially in Germany after Angela Merkel's tragic, disastrous decision to let in more than 1 million refugees from Muslim countries and primarily Syria into Germany. Let's not make those same mistakes again. Now, next question. Ken Kowalczyk of Hampton, New Hampshire writes, Israel is engaged in a religious war with jihadist Muslims. And then he goes on to quote the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who wrote, when God promised the land of Israel to Abraham's descendants, the land in its entirety became and remains to this day the inheritance of every Jew, not subject to negotiation or trade. It is solely God's promise to Abraham that constitutes our connection to our land. When we articulate this confidently and unapologetically, the community of nations will acknowledge its truth. In contrast, basing our claims to the promised land on treaties, military victories, or diplomatic machinations will undermine other nations' respect for our inheritance, unquote. And he goes on to say, my question is, why have not supporters of Israel, including Israeli spokesmen and Jewish leaders, both secular and religious, kept this in the forefront in the issue of rescinding what is, in effect, a 75-year-old outstanding fatwa against Israel? And he adds, thanks, keep up the good work. Well, thank you. Well, I'm not going to debate with the late Lubavitcher Rebbe about the rights of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, which I agree are absolute. But obviously Israel's rights, Jewish rights, also are based on history and international law. We have a good case to make for that, and we should not fail to make that case. As to whether an assertion of rights is important, well, of course it is. When, as many of the past Israeli governments did, especially during the Oslo era, they spoke of only Israeli security concerns and rarely of Jewish rights, whereas the Palestinians and Palestinian Arabs and Israel's opponents only spoke of the rights of the Palestinian Arabs. Rights always trump security concerns in the world, in the court of public opinion. So I think that is an important point to remember. That is not to say that if the Israeli people want to make a decision, and if there were a peace partner, which currently there is not, among the Palestinians, well, I think certainly those of us in the diaspora have to respect that right. But I don't think anyone seriously thinks there is a peace partner, not in the foreseeable future. So Jewish rights have to be asserted. The fact that there are so many Palestinians and that they do live in Judea and Samaria, I think the attempt to give the Palestinian Authorities autonomy. I mean, Israel doesn't want to run the daily lives of the people of the Arabs of Judea and Samaria any more than it wanted to be put in a position to run the daily lives of the people of Gaza. That said, Israel's rights, Israel's security must be respected, and the Palestinians will have as many rights as they're willing to give to the Jewish people and to Israel. And until they're ready to accept the Jewish state, the legitimacy of a Jewish state, no matter where its borders are drawn, the status quo is probably as much as we can hope for. I think a little later we'll get into this question of sovereignty, assertion of sovereignty, which some people call annexation over Judea and Samaria. But for the moment, I'll say you're absolutely right. We should always assert the right and the justice of the Zionist cause, of the rights of the Jewish people, which is rooted in part in our faith, but also in history and in law. And we should not neglect any of those. Shlomo, who writes to us from Israel, asks, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what Netanyahu and Trump might accomplish together. Well, they could accomplish a great deal. This is an enormous opportunity, both for the United States to sort of reboot its foreign policy after 4 years of weakness, defeat, and disaster abroad. And it is an opportunity for Israel to work again with the president who, certainly in his first term, was the most pro-Israel president in the history of the U.S.-Israel relationship. Now, I think when we speak of what they can accomplish together, I think most people are thinking about two things: the Iranian nuclear threat and expanding the Abraham Accords. Um, I think we have to acknowledge some realities about the Iran issue. Number one, Iran is already, thanks to Joe Biden's decision to go back to the Obama policies of appeasement of Iran and attempted rapprochement with them, discarding Trump's maximum pressure policy, which was working. It might well have worked to force Iran to step back from its nuclear program had Trump been reelected in 2020. That didn't happen. And as a result, and this has been clear for over a year, Iran is only days away from being able to have enough material to assemble a bomb. They're already a threshold nuclear power. The question is, what are they going to do with that? Do they take that next step? And if they do, is Israel and the United States, are Israel and the United States going to do something about it? I think if Iran did take the next step and did so publicly, I think the United States and Israel would do something about it. But I would also say the one thing that Donald Trump does not want to do in his second term, just as was true of his first term, he does not want any more foreign adventures. And I dare say the American people don't want any more foreign wars, and they're right not to want to. Now, Iran could precipitate this regardless of those wishes. Can Israel do it on its own? Well, maybe. Certainly Israel could damage Iran's nuclear program. Joe Biden didn't want them to touch it. They may well get to that, and Iran may well force that issue. But we'll see. Certainly there will be much more cooperation between the United States and Israel on Trump's watch as his second term unfolds. Now, as to the question of expanding the Abraham Accords, I think there is an opportunity there for there to be more countries in the Islamic and Muslim world recognizing Israel, having diplomatic relations. Will that include Saudi Arabia? Well, everybody seems to think that it will. I've always been somewhat skeptical about that. The Saudis seem to like their relations with Israel the way they are right now just fine. Israel is already a tacit military ally of Saudi Arabia against the common and most dangerous foe of Iran. Will that be enhanced if Israel has an embassy in Riyadh and the Saudis have an embassy in Israel? Well, maybe, but I think the Saudis and Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, I think he's quite satisfied with the relationship now. He wants to keep his options open. And also the legitimacy of the Ibn Saud house and its regime and throughout the century of its rule, which began after World War I over what is now Saudi Arabia, has been its stature as the guardian of the holy places of Islam, Mecca and Medina. It was always a religious regime as well as a family regime. And I'm still skeptical. As much as they like business relations with Israel, flyovers, there's a lot of warmth underneath the table between Israel and Saudi Arabia. I'm not convinced that under the current circumstances, that they will really go the whole way as the United Arab Emirates did and Bahrain to, sign on to its own version of the Abraham Accords. And indeed, when the Biden administration belatedly tried to revive the Abraham Accords after spending its first couple of years in office, denigrating it, really not even referring to it by name, the Saudis asked of the United States, of the Biden administration, was basically they asked for the moon. They asked, not only for a written treaty of mutual defense, they asked for American help in giving them a nuclear program. Well, I don't think either of those will happen no matter who is president. Even a Trump administration, which is likely to be a lot more friendly to the Saudis than Biden and the Democrats were, there isn't going to be a full treaty between the United States and the Saudis. Treaties are, as John Kerry observed when he was getting the Iran nuclear deal in through the back door, treaties are really hard to pass in a Senate where you have to get 2/3 of the vote. And there is no way in the world that the United States are going to give the Saudis a nuclear program. That is a non-starter. I'm not sure that the Saudis wouldn't make the same ask of Trump. And his answer will frankly be the same as Biden in that case. No and no. So that I don't think is going to happen. But I think the mutual cooperation between the two countries, with Trump and Netanyahu being in power, working well together with a common goal of pushing back the influence of Iran and terrorism, and a Trump administration that is not determined either to save Israel from itself and push on them really dangerous, suicidal peace plans that won't work. And also a Trump administration that, unlike the Biden administration, was not committed to trying to overthrow Netanyahu, as Biden was from the moment that Netanyahu won the November 2022 last Israeli election. So I think they'll work well together. We don't know what crises will pop up in the future. The United States needs to help Israel deal with the Houthis and their interdiction of international shipping in the Horn of Africa. The reason why the United States got a navy over 230 years ago was because to defend the freedom of the seas. I think that's an issue on which Israel and America can work well together, and which Biden was certainly feckless about. So there are a lot of things where they can work together. I think the idea that this new coalition of like-minded, U.S. and Israeli leaders will solve the Iran problem and bring the Saudis into the circle of peace, that might be a trifle optimistic, but we'll see. Now, Dr. Murray Gordon of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania writes, what will happen with judicial reform in Israel during 2025? Well, that's an interesting question. Those of us who care about Israel and those of us who follow and cover it spent most of 2023 debating the question of judicial reform. I think the issue is still ripe. I think it will remain ripe until it actually happens, which eventually I'm quite sure it will. The notion of Israel's judiciary basically having control over far more and having far more power than any judiciary has in any democracy, that's not going to last forever. And it's basically what it amounted to, this debate, was a culture war, as the people who lost the last Israeli election and who fear that they're not going to win any more elections because of the demographic growth of the religious and nationalist population, Mizrahi Jews and Haredi Jews, together, that the secular liberal, elites who, sort of dominate Israel's educational, legal, and business worlds, as well as, the judiciary. The courts, and certainly the Supreme Court, is their last grasp of power, and they were determined to hold on to it, and to delegitimize the Netanyahu government, quite frankly, weaken the country prior to October 7th, which I think played a part in what happened on October 7th. Both sides blame each other in Israel for that. The left claims that Netanyahu divided the country by proposing judicial reform. Obviously, the right says by calling into question the willingness of reservists to serve if Israel got actually more democratic. I mean, the notion that judicial reform is an assault on democracy is simply gaslighting. But will this issue be revived? I don't think it will be revived as long as the war against Hamas and Hezbollah in Iran is going on. Obviously, it needed to be put aside. I think it will take another victory by the national religious camp at a future election. The next election is probably going to happen sometime in 2026 or late 2025. We'll see. They passed a budget in Israel, so Netanyahu's coalition is safe for the moment. I think the next Knesset with a majority, a Likud-led majority, will take it up. And sooner or later, it will pass because they're going to have the votes. And the notion that Israel has a judiciary that can pick its successors and cherry pick any idea without, needing justiciability, without having anybody needing standing, and to interfere in anything that goes on and to protect its power unilaterally, I don't think that lasts forever. But I don't think it's going to, as much as I think people on the right and people who favor judicial reform are outraged by the actions of the Supreme Court in trying to shore up their power and ensure that their power can never be trimmed back to where it is in other democracies. They're right to be outraged about that, but I don't think that is going to be acted upon until this war is over, and probably till another government led by the right is elected. Now, Diana Peters writes, I enjoy your programs on YouTube in my home in Colorado and also when residing in Carmel, Israel. My husband and I are making Aliyah and purchasing a second home there. Good for you. That's wonderful. My question is, do you consult the Torah and Tanakh when searching for answers to questions about where are these events leading, quote unquote? As a believer in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and as a person of the book, she writes, I'm finding it fascinating to follow current events by following JNS on my laptop with the scriptures open on my lap. Well, I can't say I have the scriptures open while I'm doing my work. I am, of course, and I think the rest of the JNS staff is too, deeply influenced by our religious background and our grounding in Jewish learning that makes us part of who we are and how we approach the world. And we approach the world from a point of view that the Jews have rights, and those rights are rooted in our past, in our religious tradition, as well as in, as I said before, history and international law. So we do, certainly, our religious faith, our learning influences everything we do, but we're also journalists. I often say, as a journalist, I am not free to report about a world that doesn't exist or about a world that I would like to exist, as I think many people in journalism do. I try to report about the world as it is, and to be as honest and factual about it, and to bring as much understanding as we can. That's the whole point of JNS, as we try to bring you news about the Middle East, Israel, the Jewish world, the United States, shorn of it, without the left-wing bias, reporting honestly and fairly. And yes, we certainly are living in a world which, as persons of faith, as most of us at JNS are, that influences us. But we're also trying to tell you the truth about how things are, giving you the real world as it is, and trying to give you food for thought about that. Now, Mitch from Toronto, Canada writes, thanks for all the great JNS content, which I watch on YouTube. Can Israel seize the opportunity presented by its military successes and the incoming Trump administration? And he has, whether it is the one Jewish state envisioned in former U.S. Ambassador to Israel David Friedman's book, which looks far more within reach now than when he released the book months ago, or some other solution that affirms Israel's sovereignty and security and closes all refugee claims, it looks to be up to Israel to state its claim and set the terms of its victory. The Trump administration won't lead on this, only enable it. This has to have broad public support in Israel for it to last through future governments that succeed Netanyahu and also Trump. And there isn't much time to reach that consensus before the window of opportunity closes. Yet I see very little discussion of this in Israel, at least in the English language media I can find. Well, that's an excellent question, Mitch. I think at some point we'll go back to the debate that certainly Israelis and friends of Israel were having, certainly in this country, about whether Israel should assert sovereignty as some people say, annex Area C within Judea and Samaria, Area C under the Oslo agreements, which is where the Jewish communities that are in Judea, Samaria are. There are some in Israel and here argue that it won't make much difference because Israeli law already operates in the territories we're in Area C. But of course, it would make something of an important difference if it were legally then part of Israel, rather than this sort of ad hoc situation which exists in the territories. Can Israel take advantage of this moment and assert sovereignty over the territories? Well, maybe. But I think you raised an important point about how this has to be a matter of consensus. I'm not sure there is, at least in this moment, this political moment in Israel, a consensus behind that. Certainly a lot of people who support the current government believe in it and think that's what it should do. Maybe even a plurality of Israelis back it. But I think Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is a shrewd political player as well as world statesman, understands that that might be sort of getting over his skis a little bit. His government is, as I said a little while before, it's secure for the moment. But, its mandate right now is to finish the war, win it, deal with whatever fallout that the inevitable commission about responsibility for October 7th happens, what that will bring. Certainly it happened on Netanyahu's watch, and there's an unassailable argument that he deserves some of the blame simply because he was prime minister then, although I would argue, as I think many in Israel do as well, that the primary blame goes to the military and security establishment, as it did in 1973 when Israel was surprised by the October War. That those people it happened on their watch, they failed primarily. It was primarily their failure. And it was also a failure of a political consensus. When I hear people from Israel's opposition blaming Netanyahu for allowing Hamas to be able to do this, I was like, my response is, where were you before October 7th? There would have been no support for Israel to go into Gaza, or almost no support to go into Gaza before October 7th. Very few people I knew in Israel, other than those who lived in the former settlements in Gaza, had any appetite at all for regaining control over Gaza. They were very happy. As much as Ariel Sharon's decision to withdraw every soldier, settler, and settlement from Gaza was a disaster for Israel's security, once it was a fait accompli, going back was not something that any Israelis wanted to do. So I'm not sure that the idea that, and frankly, the members of the political opposition, most of whom were in control of a government that existed for a year and a half from 2021 through the end of 2022, they didn't have any different ideas about dealing with Hamas. But I have to get back to your question. This moment does give Israel some freedom, which it's utilizing in its dealings with the regime in Syria. But I'm not sure that right now that there is this consensus that you rightly cite must be there in order for Israel to firmly end the conflict. That I don't think is in the cards at the moment. Perhaps in the near future, and the second, but we'll see. I'm really not sure that Netanyahu is going to go that far at this moment, and I'm not sure that Trump would really want him to. Trump wants Netanyahu to sort of clean up and end this war and get this off of America's list of things to worry about, and then to start expanding peace. And I think this would then be an issue. Now, I personally, if Israel had to choose between an embassy in Riyadh and holding on to its rights over Judea and Samaria, I'm not sure that most Israelis would make that trade. I'm not sure they should make that trade. But that's something that they'll have to sort out. Next, Alan Friedman writes from Melbourne, Australia, and he says, "One of my bugbears is the way Israel haters mangle the language to cover for their anti-Semitism. Among these are the use of the term Palestinians instead of Palestinian Arabs, which has hijacked the narrative by implying that there was an ancient Palestinian indigenous people living in the region before Israel. The use of the term genocide to cast Israel as a brutal military force." And he also says the use of the term settlers and occupation to say that Israel is an occupying power, and the use of the term apartheid to demonize Israel on racial grounds. Can influential commentators unite in correcting the media and politicians whenever they use these terms, or is it too late? Well, JNS uses Judea and Samaria, doesn't refer to occupied territories. We use Palestinian Arabs. But, in terms of changing the mainstream media, the mainstream secular media, they're committed to the fake West Bank term and the idea that the Palestinians are an ancient people. But we have to keep chipping away at that. The war over language is a big part of this information war that we're fighting. That's part of the reason why JNS exists. We consider these issues really important. But at a time, let's be honest, at a time when much of the Western cultural and journalistic establishment is largely in the hands of woke leftists who think that Israel is a colonial settler state, which is a big lie, or an apartheid state, an even bigger lie. The question, getting them to say Judea and Samaria rather than West Bank is sort of the least the least likely thing that will happen. But I think people who know the truth about the Middle East have to continue to assert it. And I'm very encouraged by people like Mike Huckabee, former Arkansas governor, and President-elect Trump's nominee to be the next U.S. ambassador to Israel. He always uses Judea and Samaria. So more appointees, more people within the U.S. foreign policymaking team who use the right terms, the more likely that this change will happen, that eventually will get rid of these really misleading and dangerous terms. Next, Mark Simmons from Scotland writes, "How likely is it that Israel can become entirely self-sufficient in terms of armaments supply to the IDF now that President Trump will be in office? The Israeli government may feel obliged to continue buying from the U.S. in return for that support, even though that support is unconditional for the most part. However, a future government may blow hot and cold like the Biden administration. Heaven forbid Israel has to fight another war like this one and has to deal with another U.S. administration running interference on behalf of Israel's enemies." Wow. Good question. And I think the short answer is Israel really is not in a position to be 100% independent from U.S. arms supplies. A decision was made in the late 80s that it wouldn't create its own fighter jet, which angered a lot of people in Israel. And that was partly very self-interested when the United States ensured that it would have to use U.S. armaments. And I think even the Obama administration, in its most pro-Israel act, when it gave a 10-year plan for aid, it was looking to hold Israel hostage, just as the Biden administration, as you rightly cite, did hold Israel hostage. So I think since October 7th, there has been a greater understanding within Israel that they have to go back to working towards more independence of the United States in terms of manufacturing munitions. That's easier said than done, though, creating that kind of manufacturing base for armaments, expanding its armaments industry greatly. But I think it's something they have to consider a priority, with all that implies in terms of creating more industrial infrastructure. But I think there's always going to be a large element of Israeli security that will involve the security cooperation between the United States and Israel, where the two countries collaborate on making sophisticated weapons. And this is a deal that the United States benefits from as much as Israel. And the notion that often put about by Israel's enemies in the United States, that Israel gets so much aid and it's disproportionate and too much. Well, Ukraine's got more aid, whatever you might think about the war in Ukraine. Ukraine has gotten more aid from the United States in terms of, more than $160 billion in the last 2.5 years than Israel has gotten from the United States in its history. Just the other day, another 6 billion, and just the total has continued to grow. Obviously, the Trump administration is going to try to end that war if it can. Israel, is forced by this aid. Almost all of that aid is on U.S. armaments. The 3 billion that Israel gets, it's all on armaments. The United States as much, an aid package for U.S. arms manufacturers. But as we've seen with the slow walking and holding up of arms to Israel by the Biden administration, Israel has to leave less hostages to fortune in terms of its dependence on the United States. And as much as, I don't think that that's going to be a priority for the Trump administration, I think they understand that. And I think the evolution will continue to go more in that direction. But complete independence from the United States is probably not happening. But it will be, Israel, I think, will in the future be less dependent on the United States, and it must be. Catherine Goldman writes, I am a regular listener and great fan of your podcast. Thank you for your sanity and even-handed analysis during this roller coaster time. Thank you, Catherine. What is your opinion about the Haredim refusal to serve in the IDF? Well, that is a really hot button issue in Israel, and understandably so. The Haredim make up an increasingly large percentage of the Israeli population. I think this factored into the judicial reform debate. Yet most of the men don't, almost all of them don't serve in the army. And a very large percentage of them aren't involved in the economy either. The notion that every adult male should be studying the Torah, well, studying the Torah is a good thing, but it doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't serve your country. Now, it's difficult for American Jews, even those of us who love Israel, to tell Israelis what to do because Americans are not serving in the Israeli military. But this is an issue that Israel, it's really an existential question for Israel. If, an increasingly large percentage of its population both doesn't serve in the army, and I might add the army wouldn't know what to do with, a massive influx of Haredi recruits. But, hopefully in the future they'll get more of them. And even more dangerously, refusing to get jobs and support their families and be part of the economy, creating this enormous dependence on the rest of Israel, not only to defend the country, but to support them. That can't go on forever. As much as the Haredim have a lot of political clout because they vote and their numbers are large, that's going to change. Sooner or later, it will change. It must change just because having a community like that, which is so economically dependent and with so much poverty, it's not in their interest. And I think there is already signs of some movement as the number of Haredi recruits is small, but it's growing. So as it's one of these insoluble problems, and it is seemingly insoluble, but over time, Israel's had a lot of impossible, insoluble problems. The Palestinians, the conflict with them, it's insoluble. And people have been saying for the last, 50 years, well, it's, got to do something about it because it can't go on. Well, problems can go on. They shouldn't, but they do go on. And I think sooner or later, cooler heads and smart people will prevail here. I think there will have to be some compromise from the Haredim sooner or later, as much as that seems impossible right now. But I don't think this is viable. And if it costs them sooner or later and are forced to deal with it, I'm afraid, they'll have to make some adjustments. Just as the rest of Israel has to understand that the Haredi community is not going to give up its character and become secular or become, sort of national religious. They're going to be who they are. The Jewish people have to work together. As much as, the hostility certainly goes from both ends, from the secular to the religious and from the religious to the secular at times. Israel's long-term future depends on Jews working together, and we have to hope and pray, and I do add the word pray, that eventually this is figured out. And I think in the long view, taking the long historical view, I don't think Israelis necessarily will be talking about this in the same way as we are now in 50 to 100 years, but I won't be around for that, but we'll see what happens. Now, Jordana from California writes, I am very confused about the ownership of Gaza and Judea and Samaria, also known as the West Bank. Who actually owns these territories? I know that there is a sovereignty issue, but I'm confused as to why the United States would try to force Israel to accept a two-state solution. Alan Dershowitz says that Israel legally owns it. So why is this always a threat? And are those areas like America has its relationship with the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico? Well, first, it is not like the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, which are U.S. possessions recognized under international law. The short answer is there is no defined sovereignty over the territories. Frankly, the last international power that had undisputed control over Judea and Samaria and Gaza was, the British Empire, the British Mandate for Palestine. When the British left the mandate, the UN proposed a partition, but that partition was rejected by the Arabs. They didn't want the Arab state alongside a Jewish state, and Israel grew up in that vacuum. Other Arab states stepped in. Jordan took Judea and Samaria, part of Jerusalem. Egypt took Gaza. They don't have any rights there, really, no legal rights, no legal sovereignty. Sovereignty has to be negotiated. There is no state of Palestine, which has undisputed sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, because there never was an Arab state of Palestine. Could there be in the future? Well, I think a lot of our listeners and viewers don't think there should be. And certainly for the foreseeable future, I don't see that as even a remote possibility, because the Palestinians won't accept the legitimacy of Israel living as their neighbor. They're still committed to this 100-year war on Israel and Zionism, and we see what that's gotten them. In the long run, right now and in the long run, sovereignty is under dispute. These are disputed territories, not Palestinian territories. And if there is going to be a final legal conclusion about them, it will require all the interested parties agreeing to something. And as long as the Palestinian Arabs and those who purport to speak for them are not willing to make peace on the basis of any borders with Israel, it will remain, up in the air. And there is no sovereignty. And Israel can assert sovereignty over, certainly pre-1967, Israel may ultimately assert sovereignty over the Area C under the Oslo Accords, where the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria are. As for the rest of it, if the Palestinians want, their sovereignty there, they will have to pay for it in terms of making peace with Israel. And so long as they're not willing to do that, and if October 7th wasn't, a proof that they are not willing to do that, I don't know what is, then there will be no settlement. And ultimately, this question will be in abeyance. David Benjamin, who describes himself as an ex-Reconstructionist, writes, I often hear that the problem with Jewish anti-Zionists is that they just don't know the history of Zionism or our long religious connection to the land of Israel. But this does not explain why there are over 20 Reconstructionist rabbis on the Rabbinic Council of the Jewish Voices for Peace, which is an anti-Zionist and indeed anti-Semitic organization, I might add. He goes on to say these rabbis have spent years studying our history and Jewish thought, including multiple semesters in Israel. What is going on with these people? Well, there has always been an element of anti-Zionism within the Jewish world. Certainly before 1948, much of the Orthodox world wasn't sold on Zionism. Many secular Jews who were afraid that it would cost them their rights where they lived. And there were socialist Bundist Jews who rejected Zionism and wanted sort of autonomy within Poland and, where they could protect Yiddish culture. Well, the verdict of history on these anti-Zionist movements is clear. But yet it has revived itself, and it's sort of a very toxic nature in which some corners of the Israeli left and the Jewish left have accepted these false notions rooted in critical race theory and intersectionality, which denies Jewish rights, which elevates the Palestinians to the only kind of nationalism they're willing to support. I think there's always been this, I should say, mishigas within the Jewish people of people turning against their own and embracing the cause of their enemies. This is a minority phenomenon. It is not anywhere close to being a significant portion of American Jewry, no matter what some people on the left might say, but it is something that is causing a lot of problems. And the answer is, what are going on with these people? I think they've internalized the arguments of the enemies of the Jewish people, denying Jewish rights, smearing and accepting blood libels against Israel. And it's a disgrace. And those who embrace groups like Jewish Voices for Peace, or if not now, who are openly anti-Zionist and who engage in openly anti-Semitic agitation and propaganda against their own, not just Israel, but against American Jews who support Israel, I think they have to be kept out of the community. We have to show the rest of the world they're not part of us. They speak for no one but themselves, and we cannot accept them. Next, Sigmund Silber writes from Santa Fe, New Mexico, one of my favorite places to visit. And he writes, most liberal Jews live in blue states and oppose Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Can we exchange them for the hostages in Gaza? No, we can't do that. We don't want anybody to be in the hands of the enemy. And it's horrible. That's a non-starter. But he goes on to say that it's not just Reform Jews who remember the difficulty of Jews escaping Hitler. Why do not liberal Jews understand the issue of illegal immigration? He goes on to say, I personally do not favor the removal of all illegal immigrants. After all, we did not enforce our own laws, and many are good residents. Can there not be some compromise and remove only troublemakers? And he goes on to ask another interesting legal question. Should the state of New Mexico have a say in who should be removed? Give the last question an answer first. No, New Mexico can't have a formal say in that. That's a federal issue. Some issues are federal. Some issues in federalism, some issues are the responsibility of the state. I would say no state may make immigration policy any more than it could make its own policy on tariffs or anything else involving the rest of the world. But I would add that if a state like Texas perceives a threat to public safety, it has every right to use its National Guard to protect its people by deploying it along the border. It's a complicated question. Now, the question of illegal immigration is one on which, I think a lot of liberal Jews do act as if illegal immigrants are somehow the moral equivalent of Jews who were fleeing for their lives from Europe because there was a death sentence on every Jew. That is not the case with people coming from Central America want to enter the United States. The overwhelming majority of them are not really refugees. They're economic migrants, and I think we can have sympathy for them. But we do have laws, and there are people who observe those laws, and they emigrate to the United States by obeying the rules. And when you throw those rules out and just say anybody, erase the borders, have open borders, as Biden did throughout the first 3 years of his administration until it became just an overwhelming problem, he had to try to do something. You don't just create enormous economic and humanitarian problems by doing that. You also undermine the rule of law. And if Jews are safe in this country, it's because we've always respected the rule of law. So I think there's certainly chaos. Now, as to how the Trump administration will resolve the question of illegal immigration, people always throw around the term, the number 11 million, and they've done that for years. But the Yale Business School did a study several years ago that said, I think in 2018, that the real number was closer to 22 million. And I imagine it might be closer to 30 million now. Can even a Trump administration and, the Homeland, and sort of the czar that he's appointed to deal with this issue, Tom Homan, I don't think he can deport 30 million people or, even 10 million people. But, the priority has to be, as you say, deport lawbreakers, and the rule of law must be observed. And I think a lot of people are going to be deported, and they should be deported if they've come here. Certainly if they've come here and committed crimes, there's no argument for them to stay. And I would add, though, that anybody who illegally immigrated did commit a crime, a federal crime, by crossing the border without permission, and any of them are liable to deportation. As to how that's interpreted, as to how many people are deported, that's a problem that Trump will have to deal with. But the notion that any removal of illegal immigrants is somehow, as his political foes have said, is, reminiscent of, fascism or Hitler regime, Nazism. That's a libel. That's not true. We have a right to have borders. It seems as if some people on the left think that the only countries that shouldn't have borders are the United States and Israel, and that's a non-starter. This is a nation that it deserves to be protected. And I think this next administration will do its best to protect it, to reverse the flow of illegal immigration. Deporting all of the illegal immigrants is a huge problem. Probably not going to happen, but a lot of them are going to be deported. And when Jewish voices are raised against this, that somehow this is a Jewish issue, that's completely false. It is not. It is not a Jewish issue that the United States should be prevented from having borders. Now, next, Yisrael Avram writes, anti-Semitism is on the rise, where it's no longer safe for a Jew to live in the United States because the Muslim population is increasing to the point where they are formulating public policy against Jews. When do you think that all Jews living in the U.S. should move to Israel? Well, there has been an unprecedented surge in anti-Semitism in this country. We've seen this on college campuses, on the streets of our cities. We've seen how anti-Semitism has been mainstreamed in our discourse and in our mainstream media. But that is not the same thing as saying as that we're in the Jewish community in the United States is in a position where it must flee. This isn't Tisha B'Av 1938 when Zev Jabotinsky gave a speech in Warsaw where he urged all Jews to be evacuated from Europe. We don't have to evacuate the Jews of the United States. It's not that bad. But there is a problem. It must be addressed. And I'm hoping that the Trump administration and its Justice Department will take the actions needed to reverse the woke tide, which has mainstreamed anti-Semitism through these toxic leftist ideologies, which have taken root on college campuses throughout our culture. I think the DOJ and its Civil Rights Division, I think if they take action, the woke catechism can be rolled up like a cheap carpet. It really can. It remains to be seen whether that will happen. Now, should Jews move to Israel? Well, that Aliyah is to be applauded. It's a great thing. It's the greatest investment in the Jewish future anybody can make. But let's be honest, most American Jews are not going to make Aliyah, either in the short run or, barring some cataclysm, which I think is nowhere in the cards. And let's also remember, as much as some of us schreigewalt, as we should, about anti-Semitism, this is not Germany. The vast majority of the American people are with us, not against us. They didn't vote for any of this woke nonsense. They are, for the most part, supportive of Israel. The majority of Americans support Israel. They support the Jewish people. They oppose anti-Semitism. So as much as, we should, elevate Zionism, we'll get to more about that in the next question, Jews don't have to evacuate, that we are not in that kind of danger. We are in danger. I don't want to downplay it. And indeed, anybody who reads me every day knows that I consider this a very serious problem. But it is not a problem in which, we ought to give up on. We ought not to give up on the United States. It is a unique place. It is exceptional. Now, its exceptionalism has been under siege from the left. And if the left succeeds, in spite of a Trump administration, in making this a country where we no longer value individual rights and Western civilizational values, then you've got something to talk about. But I think that's a fight that the American people and the Jewish people can win. I mean, the Jews are the canaries in the coal mine on this issue. But this battle against woke anti-Semitism, woke toxic leftism involves all Americans. And I think it's a battle, we should not give in to despair. It's a battle we can win, and hopefully we will win. And as much as we should applaud and help those who want to make that next step and move to Israel, I'm very much opposed to the sort of catastrophic thinking that says that American Jewry is doomed. It is not doomed. The future of the Jewish people is more in Israel than ever, and we have to help it grow, help it thrive, defend it. But American Jewry is still here. Now, there are reasons to doubt the future of American Jewry because of assimilation and intermarriage and issues in which Jewish identity and a sense of Jewish people is breaking down. I don't think anti-Semitism is going to destroy us as surely as those trends will. Next, Judge Gary Silo writes from Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. Do you have any thoughts on how to reformulate Hebrew school education to promote Zionism and Judaism? Well, Judge, that is an excellent question because, in point of fact, one of the greatest failures of American Jewry is its failure to educate young Jews. And even those young Jews who are getting a Jewish education of some kind, which large numbers are getting no Jewish education in synagogue schools, and even those who are getting the best form of Jewish education in the day school movement, I'm not sure that most of those schools are doing everything they can to promote Zionism as well as Judaism. I think most of them are getting only a very cursory view of Zionism, Israeli history, Jewish history, and that has to be reemphasized. We need the Jewish educational establishment. We need to support it. We need to fund it in a way that we still are not doing as much justice as we should. But I think there is a crying need for more Zionist and Jewish education. I want to give a shout out to the Tikva Foundation and its efforts along these lines, because they get it. They understand that that's a real problem. And, their school that they founded in New York, I mean, it's just one school. That can't solve all the problems. And even its online courses, which try to address this gap in Jewish education, can't do it. I think we need a national Jewish effort on this issue. It must be, we've gotten some movement towards prioritizing Jewish education in the last 30 years since the 1990 Jewish population study, set the hairs of Jewish professionals on fire because they thought there's nobody going to be around to pay their salaries. Sooner or later, they were right to worry about that. They did start to prioritize Jewish education, trips to Israel and Jewish camps. We have to redouble down on all of that if we care about the survival of this community. And part of that has to be emphasizing Zionist education as well as, the basics of Jewish education. And I hope Jewish leaders will take heed of that and follow the Tikva Foundation's example. Next, Sarah Marcos writes, thank you for your wonderful and insightful daily podcast. No other podcast or blog is able to analyze as well the events of the day as they pertain to the U.S., Israel, and Jewish issues. Well, thank you, Sarah. I'm a secular Catholic, she writes, born in Cuba, and for the past 20 years, I've been a wholehearted Zionist and supporter of Israel, Judaism, and Jewish folks wherever and whenever I can. My non-Jewish friends often ask me difficult questions about my intense Zionism, and I'm happy to provide them the answer. But mostly they repetitively and constantly ask me about the majority of American Jews and why they continue to support the Democratic Party despite its blatant anti-Semitism. I do my best to answer that question, but frankly, I myself continue to be baffled. Well, the great Norman Podhoretz, the longtime editor of Commentary, wrote a book about why Jews are liberal. I advise you to, it's a little outdated. I don't think it's outdated. It's a little while since then, but he got to the heart of it. I think for many liberal Jews, liberal politics, liberal secular politics is more or less their religion. I think one of the great truths about the United States today is that politics now plays the role that religion used to play in most people's lives. So it's normal that would be the case. I think many Jews are still living in the past as far as, questions of right and left. 100 years ago, the right was more likely to be anti-Semitic than the left, although I think even then that was questionable. It remains to be seen. But there is some movement, as we saw in the last election, in places where Jews, in large numbers of Jews, like in New York and in Florida. I think there was movement towards the Republicans. I'm not sure that it's complete movement, because I think political liberalism, and in an era where, we live in this hyper-partisan era where people view their political parties, as central to their identity, expecting people to change their party identity and affiliation is very difficult. But many liberal Jews just hate Donald Trump. And as long as he's the standard, he or his followers or somebody like him is the standard bearer for the Republicans, they're never going to vote for the Republicans. But I think there is some movement on this issue. And, I think as the Jewish community evolves in this country and as it shrinks due to assimilation, I think as it becomes, I think Orthodox sometimes get a little triumphalist about their numbers increasing while other numbers of Jews are decreasing. But quite frankly, the character of the Jewish community in this country is changing. I think it's likely to become more conservative and more Republican as the years go by. But for the vast majority still who see themselves as political liberals, it is kind of their religion, and that's why they are stuck there. Now, our last question comes from Evan Galatz, who writes, "My most important question for you is, how is your health? Happy you seem back and strong. I missed your coverage while you were off." Well, Evan, thank you very much. You are not the only one to write this. A lot of people added it to their questions. I did have a serious health emergency in August. I was in the hospital for more than 2 weeks and was silent for a few weeks, but not for long. Even as I was beginning my recovery, I began writing again by the end of August, and I'm grateful for all the prayers and good wishes. I want to thank my colleague, Caroline Glick, the great Caroline Glick, who noted on her podcast and asked people to send in prayers. That was greatly appreciated, all of you who responded to her, and thank you to Caroline. Thankfully, those prayers were answered. I have recovered. I'm back traveling the country, giving speeches. And as you can see by going to JNS and going to our YouTube channel and the other places where you get podcasts, I'm back in the fight on these, not giving up, not giving in, continuing to write, speak, and act on the issues that we care about. Thank God I am fully recovered now. So I thank you all for all your good wishes. That is all the time we have now. But I want to thank not only those who sent in questions, but everyone in our worldwide JNS audience for watching, listening, and reading our content. It's been wonderful hearing from you, so many of you. And please continue following our work at JNS. Also, please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition. Whether you're listening to us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube Music, or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next year. And happy 2025.